This is a little bit of a special episode because I'm going to try to sort of draw the arch between some of the things I was reading and then tie it to the portfolio. The title of the episode is Looking at History Through Objects, and I got inspired by two presentations. Actually, one is a book, one's a presentation, an interview, actually, more precisely. But it doesn't matter. I'll put everything in the show notes, of course. So the point is this: like Avinav Ghosh is a writer. He writes about opium and the history of opium and tea in Asia, and his book is really an interesting arch between Eastern culture and Western culture. So there's a lot of depth in that book, and I definitely want to do a formal review once I'm done with the book. But the first, let's say, 30% of the book that I've read so far really make you think very differently about history, about how people interact with each other, and how we look at things. What I mean with that is, let's say he says, in the West, we're very sort of primed to think in terms of language and think in terms of logic and language and all the stuff that came from maybe all the way back from the Roman Empire and then the Enlightenment. So the antiquity and then the Enlightenment. So we're very logical people that use language, whether it's vernacular or mathematical language, to express what we think and then what we're going to do. And then the Eastern culture is more object-driven or more inner relation-driven. So there's a lot more subtlety in the relationships between humans and objects and objects and objects. And that's, on sort of a 30,000 view, of course, you might say, okay, who cares? But it's interesting because it gets me to the question, and this is the second inspiration I got recently, which is an interview with Gregory Aldrete, Alex Friedman, again, links in the show notes. He's a Roman historian, and he talks about like how the objects we find are often telling a much better story about the history of people than even the books and the scriptures. Now, you have to be very careful. He's the first to say that sometimes we find objects and we reinterpret them in the way we want to think about them. So he has this famous example where there's a bunch of stones and things like that found in North Africa. They look like Stonehenge. And then people think, oh, okay, the people that live where Stonehenge is today, they must have come from Africa. And the reality is that the stuff that is found in Africa is just an olive oil mill. And he's also the one who talks about olive being such a big determining factor of the Roman Empire. He's a very interesting historian in general, so I really recommend listening to the podcast, but also reading his books, because he's I would say he's kind of like the Freakonomics of history. He would some of the obvious stuff. I mean, he wrote a whole book about how Roman culture is influencing our culture today, whether it's architecture, whether it's governance, whether it's law, whether it's the way we get married, whether it's the way we talk, whether all those things are heavily influenced by Roman culture, and that's really what we call the West today. If you take the last 2,000 years, they evolved, of course, in Rome and then Europe and then the US, and we dominate the world, at least until today. And there's, of course, other cultures in the East and indigenous cultures and all other cultures that also have their own history and their own cultures and all that, but they have been, at least for now, either physically suppressed or just culturally suppressed. I mean, it's just difficult to compete with Western pop culture. But these things might change, right? But the point here is more subtle, and that's simply the question: okay, how about we look at objects and abstract a little bit from what people say and human action, and just look at objects? And then there's two really interesting questions. One is, okay, let's say 5,000 years from now, when people look at our society, what objects are they going to find? And one of the most interesting answers to that, of course, is, well, they're going to find physical objects, but also virtual objects, right? And then the other question is sort of, okay, what are the objects that define our time? And Gregory is the first to say, well, that you have to be very careful, because whenever you ask these types of questions, your answer will be very biased by the way you see the world, right? For example, I might say what is defining our time is things like, you know, electric cars, SpaceX, AI, but that's my world that I live in. Somebody else that, you know, is maybe obsessed with modern art might think differently, or somebody who works in you know, in media and entertainment, whatever. I mean, they might have different views of what defines our culture today, particularly which objects define our culture. And then the final question I want to ask today is also, okay, what are the objects that really define our investment strategy? If you abstract from all the words and the hoopla about, okay, this is what we do, you know, the purpose of orange capital is to generate wealth by investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices. Let's just abstract from all that hoopla and just say, what are the objects? If you had to replace our portfolio with objects, what would it be, right? And it's very interesting. Of course, electric car would be something, but I find, let's say, it's very important for investors to think like that, particularly sort of wealth creators that are investing in technologies, because the physical manifestation of a company's strategy or a company's growth path is really going to determine where they're going to go. You know, it was about 4 years ago when I just re-listened to an episode where I spoke about Clayton Christensen and the question of how to organize a company that is meant to disrupt industries when you don't even really know what kind of products and services you're going to be able to deliver 5 years from now, right? Like there's a difference between a non-disruptor, let's say, you know, General Mills, Nestle, Disney, the New York Times, so on and so forth. Legacy companies, they have a good sense for what they're going to be doing in 5 years. I mean, they're going to have incremental changes. Technology will change the way they do things, you know, whether, you know, the New York Times will use Gen AI to write articles or not. But overall, the business of the New York Times is not going to change much. I mean, that's why they are a legacy company, and that's why they are you know, often disrupted, right? Because they just don't change. And it's the same with all kinds of other companies. And some companies don't get disrupted. Coca-Cola has still been around because we haven't found a way to substitute for sugar water yet, and that's it. So the point is this: but what do you do with a company that is deliberately out there, conquering new markets, creating new markets, delivering products that they don't even know themselves exactly what they're going to be good for, you know, which is sort of the Clayton Christensen playbook. And the answer was, you organize around learning, right? You don't organize around objects, actually. The objects and the manifestation of your strategy are the result of your endeavor, and the endeavor is just learning. So that was kind of the conclusion. I want to dig a little bit deeper because I think it ties into this episode where we have this dichotomy between looking at objects but then really organizing ourselves about adaptive learning. This is not even on podcast. It's September 18, 2024. This is Krim Delco. For the year, we are up 10.7%. The market's up 18. We're underperforming by 7.3%. So let me first put the two inspirations out there that triggered this episode. One's Gregory Aldrete. Again, links in the show notes. He's a historian, Roman historian. He talks about the ancient culture of Rome, particularly Rome, but sort of adjacent, of course, Greek history, Persian, Alexander the Great, and then the barbarians and all of that, Byzantine. But it's focused on the kind of Rome that we associate with Rome, which is Julius Caesar, Octavian, the first emperor that creates the Roman Empire. Lots of interesting things. I think there's two aspects to his work. One is you can learn about history, but the other, more important, is really you can kind of interpolate from there and see, you know, there's an important quote. He says, in order to make decisions today, you have to have the empathy with peoples in the past, because you really are a product of what they did, whether you like it or not, right? You are embedded in a timeline that they created. They are your ancestors. And there's certainly cultural differences. So somebody in India might not have as much cultural bias towards Rome like somebody in Italy, of course. But you know, particularly the Roman culture has penetrated global culture through the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the dominance of Western culture, particularly after World War II. So there's definitely, I mean, what that means is things along the lines like, the way we get married, our calendar, the law, the code, the math, the numbers. Actually, numbers are not, we don't use Roman numbers, but we use a lot of math and a lot of art and visual art and fundamentally, here's the most fundamental influence that the Roman Empire left on us, and that's the key of this episode, which is the Romans looked at the world in verbose terms, right? They tried to formulate what's going on and then use language, whether it's vernacular or mathematical language, to express what they see and how they act and how they behave. This goes back to the Greek philosophers and then the Roman philosophers and writers, and it penetrates Western culture all the way to the scientific revolution, and it is absolutely prevalent today. Certainly very successful. So if you want to use a multiverse theory here, this is something that probably is going to get copied a lot in the multiverse. And the proof of that is, of course, that we have other cultures, in particular Chinese and Indian culture, which are jumping on that bandwagon as we speak, and are very successful at it, and are also able to adapt very quickly to that new culture, and they're very good at it. So that means it is something that seems to be working for people that come from a Roman Western heritage as well as other people. Now, there's other reasons, let's say, why you might say, okay, well, why is, let's say, the US such a prosperous country and India isn't, or China isn't? And in my opinion, it has very little to do with the scientific versatility of those people. It has to do a lot more with governance and things like that. And that's not part of this episode particularly, although I'm going to mention that, of course, the governance side of things also is influenced by the Romans. They were the first with the Republic, or let me rephrase that. They were the first large empire that actually tried to implement the Republic. It didn't work. They then created an empire under Octavian, and that lasted for about 400 years, and then they collapsed, and then the Byzantine Empire kept on going for another 1,000 years, and then they collapsed. And ever since, we had actually, unfortunately, a lot more empire-type governances around the world, with one exception, and that is the United States, which has implemented the idea of the Republic in 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. And that's really what we're all fighting for today, right? To keep that little sprout alive, of sprout of freedom, sprout of if you want to boil down the culture of the United States, it has very little to do with Western culture or Eastern culture or indigenous culture. It's obviously a potpourri of all kinds of cultures. But the one thing that we should be all fighting for tooth and nail is to keep that sprout of freedom that has emerged from definitely from the Roman Republic, and the ideas from the Roman Republic, such as law, for example, the law, which is a code that is written in words and that is above even the emperor. There was no emperor, and Julius Caesar tried to actually annex the Roman Empire to his and become a dictator, and that's why they killed him. And then Octavian became the first real emperor, but even he had to be very careful in not getting killed. The Romans were very peculiar about not having a king or not having a dictator. They weren't able to prevent that. But what's important here for this discussion is simply the fact that we have been influenced by Rome, and that we want to look at history from an object perspective. Now, when I say object, I don't necessarily mean just physical object. I also mean, let's say, this concept of the law, which is really what defines the Roman Republic and what has penetrated today. Now, on another note, I'm also reading a book, Smoke and Ashes, by Amitav Ghosh. Sorry for the mispronunciation if I do mispronounce it. Amitav Ghosh writes about the opium and tea trade in Asia and how that has really formed the history of Asia for hundreds of years. Some of it a little bit bleak, the colonial history of Britain. Some of it also maybe hopeful, like how this trade has enabled whole societies to evolve around technologies and prosperity, and how I guess most importantly though, how physical goods, the opium trade in that sense, opium and tea, how they really define the history, right? If you ask yourself what is the defining object of 18th century China or India, it is opium. And unfortunately, of course, because it has brought actually a lot of suffering, and that's a whole different story. This whole idea of narco trading, narco states, narco everything, we're struggling with that today. But what I find interesting in his book, in the early parts of the book, he really tries to emphasize a different perspective on history and life in general, and more of a sort of physical object-driven perspective. So, for example, he says that growing up in India, he had very little exposure to China. At least he thought so, because there's been some issues between India and China. There was a war in 1960, and they kind of don't like each other. But then he realizes that, for example, the word cha, which is tea, comes from the Chinese word for tea, and that porcelain and Chinese cups were readapted, of course, in an Indian version. So there's a lot of objects that do penetrate even Indian culture, and to me that made me think, okay, objects do matter, right? And that goes back to Gregory also, who talks about that a lot. Objects really define, and by the way, when I say objects, it can be physical, it can be virtual, it can be, like I said just before, Roman law, it could be cultural objects, if you will, like customs. But if you look at history, you might want to look at those things, and really, because they tell you a good story about what that particular space and time is. Because, people talk a lot, you can read scriptures, novels, and that's all good. But as they say, don't listen to what they say, look what they do. And part of what they do is, of course, they create objects, right? So, for example, whether the British Empire was trying to proliferate Christianity in India or doing whatever else they were claiming to do, if you looked on the ground, there was a very clear hierarchical installation of opium traders. I mean, the East India Company, I think it was called British East India Company. Is that right? I'm not sure. I could be butchering the name, but anyway, the company that was in charge of the East India trade was basically a large drug cartel, and that's that just tells you something about the culture, about the environment that was back then, right? And you can argue whether that's good or bad and what you want to do with this today, and so on and so forth. That's not the topic of this episode. I'm just saying, what is the culture of a people? And you can look at, I think, looking at objects, looking at particular circumstances is often much more revealing than maybe just looking at scripture and books and things like that. So brings me to the question, okay, what if 5,000 years from now people dig up stuff about us, 2024, right? What are the objects that define our time? And there's a very important caveat that Gregory Aldrete actually puts in the Friedman podcast, which is, he says, look, they will interpret our time through their lens. That's very, very important, right? They'll find stuff, whether it's physical or virtual. By the way, they can find virtual objects, gaming characters or websites or whatever they're going to find, but they're going to interpret our time through their lens. That's super, super important, right? The same way we interpret the fall of Rome, right? We think about it like, well, there was a country, I'm 100% sure most people think of the fall of Rome like Rome is a country with a border and it just falls, right? It's taken over. Like they walked in and took it over. Like the Maginot Line broke and Germany took France. That's how Rome fell. But that's not true. That's looking at it through our lens. We have a globe full of nation state. I think there's about 137 nations on this globe. That's a about 120, 150-year-old concept. Before that, there weren't any nation states, and particularly there was no nation state back in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was much more of a fluid thing where people were sort of annexed, not annexed. Some people were raised Roman and then sent back to run provinces and blah, blah, blah. Think about the information flow and the communication. There's a big problem in computer science called the Byzantine generals problem. Well, why is it called the Byzantine generals problem? Because Rome had this huge problem, which is that they were huge and they had to communicate over long distances, over long periods of time, and they couldn't solve the problem, or they had to solve the famous problem of how do I make sure that my message gets from A to B and that the person that receives the message is the intended person and that the content is intended and all of that stuff. That's the Byzantine generals problem. And what I'm trying to say here is that when we look at Rome today, we look at it through our lens. In the same way, people will look at our time through their lens. But nevertheless, let's just, for fun, think about, okay, what are the objects that define our time? And look here, lo and behold, I'm already biased by my lens, because I would say, well, Tesla, SpaceX, AI, NVIDIA, virtual objects such as GPT and ImageNet and AI and so on and so forth. But that's because I am, of course, biased by my world and the view of the world that I have. And others might have different biases. If you're a graffiti artist, you might think the world today is all about parkour and graffiti and whatever. I mean, you get my point, right? Now, I would say that there are certain things that if I asked 1,000 people, probably a lot of people would actually say, yes, SpaceX certainly is sort of an object that defines our time. GPT, LLMs, that kind of thing, probably electric cars. But I want to dig a little bit deeper and just sort of end this episode with, let's not forget the purpose of this podcast series is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So how do we tie this back to our business? And let's ask ourselves, okay, what are the objects that define our portfolio? And of course, it would be a Tesla car, it would be Dojo, it would be Megapack, it would be NVIDIA, GPU clusters. So those are the kinds of objects, yes. But how about we go a little bit deeper? And I just want to sort of use this opportunity to talk about another very interesting episode by The Limiting Factor, which is about the Etherloop at Tesla. So why am I talking about the Etherloop? How did I get from Roman Empire and opium trade to Etherloop? Because it's an object, right? And it defines, in my opinion, it defines a time. It defines a portfolio. It defines wealth creation. What is the Etherloop? The Etherloop is a way to communicate data within a car. And Tesla has been developing over a decade now a technology called the Etherloop, which is, and please check out the Limiting Factors episode on this. Really excellent, like most of his stuff, but this is really, really good. In my opinion, the best episode I've ever seen by him, because it's a bit less pedantic. That's one of the things that I don't like about it. He's a bit too pedant, sciencey. This is a lot more accessible. The fundamental idea is the following: like, if you want to have a software-defined car, well, you have a car consists of many, many controls, right? Whether it's whipper blades, whether it's brakes, whether it's this, whether it's that, infotainment. And if you even want to go more software defined and define things like braking and steering and gas and all of that software, which is really where FSD is going and where hopefully soon the robotaxi will be revealed is going, you need to find a way to communicate within that car without having, tons of cables and controllers and a super, super complex computer system. And the way you could do that is through having this Etherloop, which is, think of it like, instead of having lots of cables going from controller to here and there and there, sort of the current technology, which is called CAN, which is, I think, something, I'm not sure what it stands for. It's Controller Area Network, which is really, that's kind of a network that goes from all kinds of regions in the car and connects controllers with each other and has sort of a central control system that tries to synchronize those controllers. That's how things have been done for I think since the 1980s. What Tesla is doing is to replace all that with this Etherloop, which is a very simple loop that has a data network and an energy network that delivers energy and data to actuators, and it has the distance between when the actuator is triggered and the actual actuator, so the moment and the time and the location is relatively close. So you can save yourself a lot of cable and also have a lot more software-defined driving. Let's, for example, steer by wire and things like that. Why am I talking about all this? Because I think this Etherloop actually is a very good example of what we say when you want to invest in disruptive technology. Just look at the objects, look at what the company is doing and learning and where this might go. Where is the Etherloop going to go? It's going to create a robo-taxi. It's going to have a low-cost car. By the way, what the limiting factor also does really well, it's connecting the dots in a sense that this Etherloop will allow for unboxed production. So what we're having here is a solution which enables a couple of things. One is a low cable-intensive, high software-defined networking solution for the car, and also enabling unboxed production, which is we can have maybe one or two casts and then just put the car together in a Lego type way. And that is enabled by the Etherloop. So the reason we're using this example is not, it's not like the future of Tesla depends on the Etherloop, but it's a very good example of how this company is functioning. It's iterating around technologies that enable new solutions for new kinds of problems that we don't even know about, and that will most fundamentally lower the cost and increase the value of the product, which is really what disruption is. So to summarize, I think looking at the world through objects is a very interesting concept, whether it's looking at it through Roman history, the opium trade in Asia, or our portfolio. It's interesting to look at objects. I think we do this instinctively as hedge fund managers, particularly in our part of the finance world, which is we really are interested in fundamentally new concepts in engineering practice. So we look at what actually is being done, what objects, what software. Again, the objects could be virtual or physical. What is there? What are they actually doing? And where might this go? And that's how we tie our thinking together with our portfolio and our wealth creation strategy. Thank you.